welcome to this panel discussion for discussing what is wrong with the Indian economy. We will, of course, also feature on what is right with the Indian economy, hopefully. May I, before I we commence the discussions, may I just put a couple of housekeeping thoughts on board. Number one, just to put the mobiles on the silent mode. And number two, given the arrangement of the room, angularities are difficult to be accommodated. So the ones on this side of the room, may I request them to maybe, if possible, because otherwise you'll be just getting the backside view of the speakers. Not the best way of viewing the settings. Thank you so much. So without further ado, we today have two very distinguished economists with us, and both of them are from India. Both of them have been handling Indian policies for a rather long time. And let me first give a very brief context as to what the background to the discussions today. The news coming out about the Indian economy for quite some time is actually rather disappointing. And this disappointment extends to various aspects of the economy, not the least of which is the fact that India recorded a growth rate of only 5% in the last financial year, which was one of the lowest in this century. And particularly disappointing given the fact that there was a period in the last decade when India was growing at a trend average rate of almost 8.6%. So coming from there, this is a rather sharp comeback in the rate of growth. And along with that, another development which has obviously been taken as a major indicator of the fact that the Indian economy is looking down the barrel is the fact that the Indian rupee has plunged very sharply against the American dollar. And in fact, every 2 or 3 days, it's creating new records for itself as far as going down is concerned. This has had the expected effect on the foreign exchange reserves, because the Reserve Bank of India, in spite of putting up a brave front on a number of occasions, has occasionally had to intervene in the market. It has had to release dollars and strengthen the value of the rupee. But on the whole, the concern that is beginning to come up now is that whether, if this trend continues, does India really have enough foreign exchange reserves to handle this macroeconomic imbalance, which is increasingly assuming rather alarming proportions. And at the same time, domestically, elsewhere, the industrial production and exports continue to stagnate. So to that extent, there is hardly good news coming out from any sectors of the economy. There is concern over the fact that the twin deficits, which India has been handling for some time. In fact, there was a time about 7 or 8 years ago when the current account deficit in India had actually briefly changed to a surplus in the early years of the last decade. The fiscal deficit was being brought down in a time-bound manner. But all those now seem to be rather distant visions, because all those appear to have gone back to the old days. And some analysts have actually, some doomsday predictors have gone to the extent of saying that there's a comeback or a sort of a resurrection of the dark days of the early 90s. Now, why is all this happening? And why is it that India suddenly finds itself in a rather precarious position, so as to say, to put a journalistic phrase on board? Why has the wind gone out of the India story globally? Well, there may be several explanations. It could be a part of the cyclical downturn from which the global economy is yet to entirely recover as a whole. It could also be a result of basic structural problems that the Indian economy has been nursing for a long time, has not been able to overcome them, and eventually, accompanied with the cyclical downturn of the global economy, the situation is becoming all that much worse. So much so that the economy is actually finding itself in a rather difficult position. In fact, it's not always that the credit rating agencies periodically send out threatening signals that if you cannot manage yourself by another 0.1 percentage points, we are going to downgrade you. So it's basically 0.1 percentage point of the GDP that the finance minister has been desperately trying to manage for some time now. And of course, beyond all this is the question that can the India growth story come back? And will India continue to live up to the expectations, or at least get reasonably close to a part of the hype that was generated about India way back in the early years of the last decade when the BRICS report was announced? Or is it going to be the first to follow the BRICS poll? Now, of course, I'm not going to answer any of these. What I'll do is that I'll leave it to my two very distinguished panelists to take a look at all this, but it's a pleasant duty to introduce both of them to you. Assuming that left is right, I'll start with my left. Dr. Supriyo De has been with the Ministry of Finance for now almost as long a time as I was there, 8 years. And he has worked with two chief economic advisors, both of whom have, in a sense, gone on to greener pastures. First it was Professor Kaushik Basu. Subsequently it was Dr. Raghuram Rajan. She's still with him for another 15 days before he takes over charge. Supriyo is officially called the Officer on Special Duty to the Chief Economic Advisor in the Ministry of Finance, India. He belongs to the Indian Revenue Service, and nobody other than him would know better the desperate need of revenues that India has right now. He has worked in several departments of the government of India, and he is a PhD in economics from the University of Sydney. He's a master's in economics from the Yokohama National University. Japan is part of a World Bank scholarship program. He was also an Emerging Leaders Fellow in the Australia-India Institute in the University of Melbourne. He has been writing very substantive policy papers. He has contributed to the new Oxford Companion to Economics in India, which was edited by Kaushik Basu and Annie Maintenance. And he, of course, has journal articles to his credit. To my right is Professor Shubhashish Gangopadhyay, who has saddled the academic world and the policy world with equal ease and expertise, if I could say. And right now he is the director of the School of Social Sciences and Humanities in the Shiv Nadar University in India. He is the director of the India Development Foundation. There was a time when he was the advisor to Mr. P. Chidambaram in the Ministry of Finance. He is also a visiting professor at the Gothenburg University in Sweden. He, of course, has several very distinguished academic positions. He has been holding prestigious Malmsten guest professorship and the Bertil Danielson guest professorship not too long ago, 2007, 2008, a PhD from the Cornell University in US, spent several years in the Indian Statistical Institute at then. And also, to round it off, he is the chief editor of a couple of major academic journals on emerging market finance and infrastructure. So what I'll do is, as usual, as is my bad habit, I'll try to make it as provocative as possible, and I'll assume that we get the right view from the left first and ask Dr. De to give the official version, not official, this is his personal version, I'm sure he will come up with a disclaimer. And then I'll provoke Professor Gangopadhyay to sort of react to that. You never know, the two views might converge as well. And then we'll, of course, try to make it as stimulating as possible in the time that we have with us. So, Shukriya, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending this. And to begin with, as he mentioned, there's a disclaimer. This is a personal slideshow of mine, personal views. They're not really official views of the Government of India or anyway the policy views of the Government of India. However, I would like to thank my current supervisor and mentor, Dr. Raghuram Rajan, for a lot of ideas and inspiration, but they're not really his views. And definitely to my very close colleagues, Rohini Malkani, Dr. Prachi Mishra, and Aman Mohanta, for some of the analytical insights on which I draw upon in this lecture. Without further ado, I twist this whole thing around and say that this is a challenge as opportunity. Okay. That's one way of looking at it. And we can continue discussing why I said so at a later point of time. Quick macro view of things in a comparative note. As the BRICS were mentioned, I've put BRICS plus T into this to just say that, look, there's been widely reported there's emerging markets being rebalanced. It's a bit of a shift. This is not Government of India data. This is IMF's WEO Outlook, April 2013. These are IMF projections, so they don't strictly match with the Government of India projections simply because we follow a GDP at factor cost across the Indian financial year, whereas these are calendar years GDP at market prices. But if you see the IMF projection, India is not really a laggard when it comes to the BRICS in any manner. In fact, it's second only to China as far as the projections go. When it comes to the current account balance, again, last year's current account balance, India was again not really a laggard in that regard. South Africa was worse, and so was Turkey. When it comes to the foreign exchange percentage change, this is maybe a bit dated, but having said that, again, the South African rand and the Brazilian real have been performing much worse. This is January to July of this year changes. So to that extent, one of the things I find, in fact, is my former boss, Dr. Kaushik Basu, used to say that one of the heartening things about what expectations about India have changed is that when it goes down to 5%, people are mourning and groaning and saying this is the end of the world. This was the economy that was famously known for its Hindu rate of growth, 2%. So 5% is a respectable rate of growth by a lot of global standards, especially in a year when the rest of the world was doing pretty badly. But we'll also talk about more of this later. Now, what's the growth challenge? Now, all this seems things to be where 5% is really a decent growth rate. It seems to be grounding to a halt only because in 2009, 10, and 10, 11, we had growth rates of 8.6% and 9.3%. These are the Indian figures. Compared to that, it was 5% last year. The main slowdown, if you notice, came in industry. It was both agriculture growth and industry. Services not doing that badly. There are other activity indicators, which again, the industrial production really came down to 1.1% last year. And those are the PMI averages. I'll just track them just for your information. Industrial production is really what came down sharply, but let me give you a word of warning on this. The statistics that generate this, or the underlying data generation process, is known to be very volatile. And there's really a move that we should be moving to a more wider base of looking at industrial production. These are all survey data that we collect regularly. But having said that, this has been the worrying trend that has kept people, given people sleepless nights. And then there is inflation. Now, the inflation story, if you see, is actually not a bad story. It's actually a good story. Because if you see WPI inflation, the trend has been coming down. It's the CPI inflation which needs to be split. So if you see the CPI inflation, the thing to observe is the difference between the red line, which is CPI without food, which is like a core inflation, and just the food inflation, which is the grey dotted line. And this is a story I'll add on to later. Just remember that I've talked about the fact that there is a divergence between food and non-food inflation. And that's very important in terms of structural aspects and in terms of something I'll speak to you later about. That is the rural consumption story. Now, the happy story that's not noticed in a lot of the media, in a lot of the news, in a lot of the data that's coming out is that India is actually undergoing a rural, almost a consumption boom. The problem there is that our consumption data is collected infrequently. This comes from the national sample surveys. So the thing to observe is rural non-food consumption across the last 2 years, 2010 to 2012. It's increased by 23.5%. When you compare it, the urban one has increased by only 18.1%. And this also ties up with a lot of other stories. It ties up with the gold story. If I have time, we'll talk about the gold story, which has a major impact on the current account deficit. It also ties up with a lot of other things, but this is something that I would like to stress with another slide, which is we tried to track as to whether rural consumers are consuming or not, and it was very difficult because we don't have the kind of consumption data that a lot of developed countries have. So we went down to Maruti Suzuki, our large car manufacturer, and asked them, what's your rural sales going like? And their rural sales, from 2009, it was about 10% of total sales. It's climbed up to way over 1/4. It's now looks like to me about 27 to 26% of total sales. And that's a big consumption story. And that's something that's not going around, and something that's also causing a bit of a asymmetry in Indian society of a different kind. There is also, this is a really positive thing that's going on, which is an exogenous factor way beyond anyone's control, that we are having a good monsoon this year. We have a good monsoon this year, so rural prospects are something that are really bright in India. The only thing is how does the rest of the world convert this into a modern economic opportunity? That's a challenge we can leave for the discussion later. So we have an increase in rainfall about 15% compared to minus 20% for the same period last year. And that's a big change. And a lot of Indian rural consumption depends on the monsoon. It's largely, I think in the morning we were discussing about 60% of Indian agriculture is rain-fed. So this is likely to have a big effect on agricultural production and rural consumption. There is also the fact that one aspect that has been an achievement is that 12-13, we were faced with a difficult fiscal situation. So we committed ourselves to a fiscal deficit of 5.3% of GDP. Now, the actual numbers that we achieved were even better. It was 4.9%. The gross direct collections of direct tax collections this year, up to July, they have increased by 13.3%. So the fiscal, to that extent, the tax collections seem good. There are other aspects. There's other little good news that has come in, which is naturally to be expected. We can't say whether it's a really beginning of a trend, but this year, the last July export figures, exports have increased by 11.6%, whereas imports have decreased by around 6.2%. So the trade deficit, so to say, which for those of you who remember your macro, well, connects on to the current account deficit as well. It's a part of the current account deficit. The trade deficit is likely to go down. And this is natural, right? The thing happens that a lot of news that I see coming out becomes irrationally exuberant, to use Schiller's word, or irrationally pessimistic from time to time. But if you see the way international macroeconomics works, is you can't have it all bad all the time at the same point of time. So if you are having a depreciating currency, logically at some point of time, it's going to make your exports more competitive, right? That's bound to happen. Similarly, if you have the industrialized nations likely to do better, you are going to have capital flows maybe heading out of your country, but it's likely that your exports would again go up because the developed markets would have more export demand. So these are things, there are multiple things that will balance these out, and the only way to really study these is probably do some sophisticated modeling, like DSG model or something like that. But it never, all of them don't usually work in one direction. It's always not bad and always not good. Going onwards, the recent steps I thought I needed to enumerate, and they've been coming at great frequency, including some steps were taken after I arrived here. So maybe I'll just go over it very quickly in the interest of time. It's on July 15th, they raised the marginal standing facility by 200 basis points. The broad idea is the first series of steps were taken to kind of curb liquidity that's available. The second July 23rd steps were again the same, and then RBI, so they were all liquidity curbing steps. In the interest of time, I'm skipping over this slide and going over to something that's very close to my heart, and this was the analysis we were doing. This whole question is, a lot of the exchange rate may be driven by financial factors short run. What about the equilibrium exchange rates? Now the way that is usually done is to say that if the fairly unsophisticated way of thinking about it is if you are at some level of exchange rates and you have higher inflation, then your exchange rate will depreciate to keep export competitiveness. But there is a certain theorem which is fairly complex, but to put it simply, that's the Balassa-Samuelson theorem, that simply says that as poor countries grow over time, labor productivity and their non-traded goods sector tend to rise. Because of that, because of higher productivity and higher wages in the non-traded sector, you have higher wages and higher prices even in the non-traded goods sector from the traded goods sector, leading to an overall increase in price levels. So there are two things that may happen. You can have a rising price or an appreciating currency, which is an equilibrium phenomenon. All this says is, besides the simple inflation-driven depreciation of the currency, there's going to be an opposite effect with rising productivity and appreciating effect on the currency. So there have been analysts who have been speculating things like, oh, the rupee will be at 70 or something, calculating it purely on basis of the CPI. Now, if you take this kind of calculation, we see that the rupee is not really too off the mark. Those little red dots are what the values are of the Balassa-Samuelson type of equilibrium at this point of time. Long and short of the story is there will be opposing forces at work, depreciation versus appreciation. So whichever would happen, it would be the equilibrium values would move pretty slowly. It's not going to be these dramatic shifts. The current account deficit, the way the strategy has been to manage it is basically twofold. We have committed to a target of 3.7% of GDP as our CAD target for this year. And how do we do it? The first is to import compression, which is largely in gold and silver, oil and non-essential imports, luxury goods. And of course, to meet the current account deficit, you need adequate capital flows. The way that the strategy is to liberalize the external commercial borrowing guidelines. We can discuss this later, what they mean. Liberalizing the non-resident inflows, which are NRE and FCNR deposit. And public sector financial institutions would go out there and launch quasi-sovereign bonds for long-term finance of infrastructure. Which brings us to the question, is all this financing, if they are bringing it in for infrastructure, there have been, of course, world over reports that the progress of infrastructure, the progress of investment implementation in India is slow. So what we do about it is, we'll just discuss it later. The capital account is really, if you have a look at it, I think I'll skip this and go over to the, I'll go over to the investment story. What happened is, with reports coming in and that it was difficult to implement projects on the ground, there was the formation of the CCI, which is the Cabinet Committee on Investment. It's a high-powered group of ministers who decide to fast-track all kinds of clearances. So what they have done is, the data is up to the beginning of August, where the number of projects that have been cleared, you can see that, which totals about 169,000 crores, which is roughly, I think, about 28 billion US dollars, approximately about 2% of GDP. So even if you have half of these projects coming through this year, I mean, they have all been cleared, right? But it will take time to put the projects on the ground. They have all the clearances, but even assuming that half of them come through, you have an increase in your gross fixed capital formation of about 1% of GDP just because of this. Plus, there are more projects which are in the pipeline, which are being monitored for fast-track clearances, which is about 75.5% of GDP, are strongly being monitored at the highest levels. That is, you can imagine in a parliamentary democracy, the highest level is the cabinet and the prime minister. So it's being monitored at that level. So that's the part of my presentation, and we'll go on.
Thank you, Shubhyo. So looks like there's not much that is wrong. At least there is hope. So to maybe, I mean, two wrongs don't necessarily make a right, but I'll now request Professor Gangobadaya to give his perspective.
Thank you, Jitendra. I can understand Shubhyo's problem that since he is now inside the government, I appreciate that.
I believe.
You know, when in 2008, when I was with the government, I had to, the budget was announced, and 60,000, right? 60,000 crores. You know, crores is 10 to the power 7, right? So 60,000 crore worth of loan waivers were given, and I had to, defend that on television, and with newspapers, and it's tough, I know.
He's done a good job.
He's done a very good job, basically. But I must say that, however, I do tend to agree with him, because I seriously think that the trouble is really with the Indian economists more than the Indian economy. And the reason why I say that is because this was a problem that I also faced in 2008, where almost, in India it's always good to scream fire, 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 right then, because everybody starts listening to you. I remember when at a certain, this was not 2008, because I don't want to tell you which year and why, because then you would know who it was. There was this crisis, and we were discussing it, and I was trying to argue that the crisis isn't there, and the minister at that time, for that particular thing, he said that, okay, I agree with it, I agree with you, but we must be seen to be doing something, right? Because everybody else feels there is a crisis. I'm not going to go out and say there is no crisis. Now, when we talk of inflation in particular in the Indian economy, and this is why I say I blame our own economists, is that it's important to see, like he pointed out, that the food inflation is high, and I know it is politically incorrect to mention George Bush, but if he was ever right, that was the time he was right, when he said there's more food demand and there's more food being consumed in India and China. Indeed, the type of food, the composition of food, the way it has changed in Indian rural households is quite remarkable. And I don't know how our nutritionists, our economists, our so-called consumer economists have missed this out. Because if you talk to any business, they're completely focused on the rural markets, which have been growing, he said 18%. They've actually been growing for quite a many years now, for more than 25%, right? And their size, for the first time, this was about 8 or 10 years ago, for the first time their size became bigger than the urban market. So, so these are trends in which you cannot apply the linear model of the last 20 years, right? And we have to start thinking differently. For example, in our institute, which is India Development Foundation, we carried out an experiment, right, where we took, in India we have the public distribution system by which food is distributed at cheaper rates for people below the poverty line, or households below the poverty line. So we took their ration cards away, and instead, right, gave them money equivalent to the hidden subsidy that they were getting, right, because of the subsidized prices. And we did, the usual randomized control trial, all the things that one usually does. And we found that as soon as you did that, the nutrition level did not change, but the composition of the nutrition completely changed. And households move towards more expensive food items like milk, fish, fresh vegetables, fruits, away from cereals. Now, these prices have never risen for a very long time simply because it's mostly the urban areas that were consuming it. Now the villages are doing it. You know, we did a study on the NREGS, and we did a before-after study. We constructed a social accounting matrix just to see what the money that was being spent on the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which was a scheme introduced in, I think, 2004, but really picked up from 2005, whereby every rural adult, right, it started with one member of the household, but now any rural adult can go to the government and demand work for 100 days in the year at 100 rupees per day. Okay, so that's about 10,000 rupees the government almost guarantees if somebody is willing to do hard manual labor. Now we wanted to see what impact it has on the local economy. One of the most important things it did is it prevented people from migrating during the lean season when there is no work in agriculture. But most importantly, what it did, because this money stayed in the village, it generated, so many other income activities. Farmers who were growing one crop now start growing vegetables because there is a demand for vegetables within the village, which earlier would become decimated because village of landless laborers, they will go out into the city, right, to find work those 3-6 months of the year. So the entire rural economy is undergoing changes which we, given our old methods of analysis, are just not seeing. For example, today we had this discussion in the morning that 60% it's actually 50% of the labor force is in rural India, and it produces, whereas agriculture produces only 14.4% of the GDP, right? But if you look closely at what the other statistics in about rural India says, it's that the farming age, that is age of farmers, right, has now reached almost 60. Why? Because no one among the younger generation is in farming anymore. We describe a farming household to be any household where more than 50% of the majority of the income comes from farming. But their children are not into farming, and they're all doing off-farm work. They're all in non-agricultural sector, which we are not reading at all. So these are the sorts of changes that are taking place in the economy, and to get a better idea of what we are doing or where our problem lies, we have to give up the old model of the linear models that we have, or manufacturing must grow, this can grow, because most of the manufacturing growth indeed is not in the formal sector. But if we look at the informal sector, it's really, economists haven't done this, but sociologists have done a lot of work in India, right, seeing the transformation of villages outside of agriculture. It's quite remarkable to observe. But since these are case studies, sociologists are not like economists, so they don't do the things we do and we can appreciate. We do not appreciate the sociologists. But certainly it gives a very good idea of where we should be focusing, rather than on these, the CADs and such data at the aggregate level. To give you an idea of what differences this sort of an approach does, Bihar has grown at what, close to 14% last year. So there are states in India which are growing at those rates, right? With no regard for the European crisis or the American crisis, or Japan not importing as much, or China not importing as much from India, right? And remember, India was never a big player in the international market. So I don't understand why the European crisis or the American crisis is being used as the reason why India is not doing very well. Our imports continue to rise, and that is bad, given that our exports are not growing, and that's why we have this huge deficit. But we have to start looking a bit more closely at where exactly the problem lies, and I would just mention a few very quickly in another 3-4 minutes so that we can have more discussion. So I just mentioned about this the disaggregated picture, and there are some states which are doing, remarkably well, and we have to ask ourselves how come they're doing it. The other thing that we get caught up in, and this is again, this paranoia that we have that we are going down the drain. I hate to say this because even now it is politically incorrect to say this. It's this fiscal discipline paranoia that we have. Now, almost all of us agree, including the government, that without proper health and education, we are not going to make it in the modern global world. And yet we hold ourselves back saying, where is the money? Now, if today we are attacked by some foreign country, I would challenge any of these economists, who are so focused on fiscal discipline, to be able to say, sorry, we will not defend that part of the border because we don't have the money. We are not going to say that. And today, if we look at the political situation within India, the way insurgencies and things are happening of people who feel left out of the entire political and economic process, it is as dangerous as being attacked from outside. We cannot say that we are not going to get you supplies, we are not going to give you education, we are not going to find you jobs because we have a fiscal discipline to maintain. We have to set our priorities, right? We of course need fiscal discipline, but it cannot be used as an excuse for not doing what we need to do to be able to grow properly, right? So we have to change our priorities and not say that we cannot feed the people because we have a fiscal discipline issue. That is not acceptable. And given that we are opening up the economy to a market economy, now we have TVs, everybody knows everything about what is going on elsewhere in the world, it's very, very difficult, right? And given our young population, if we do not address this right away, we will have huge social problems, because remember, we are a democracy, we are a federal structure. Delhi, even during Mughal days and British days, had never had long reaches to every parts of the country. So we are in serious trouble if we do not address this. That's what is wrong with the Indian society, I would say, rather than the Indian economy. The third thing I want to say is that we have always complained, and this is not because I'm getting old. What I'm about to say is not because I'm getting old or I'm biased. Or I am old, not getting old, and I'm biased. But we have always said that more than 50%, the median age in India was 23.7, so more than 50% of our population is below 25. So how come our Prime Minister is 86 years old? Right? And his contender is also 86 years old. His contender, who is now no longer a contender, but for a long time he was. Right? So we ask ourselves this question: why is it that the youngsters are not running the country? Now there are some young leaders, and it's shocking to see that they have not said anything, they have not done anything which is different from what their parents or grandparents were saying or are doing, if they are still in power. We have not yet politically matured to be able to take on the demands of a market-driven economy. We are still in the socialist mode, we are still in the paternalistic mode of the government knowing best. And now what has made it worse is that earlier the chief ministers were not so well trained. Now our young chief ministers are from Harvard Business School, somebody from Stanford Business School, so you can't even question them on that, whether they know or not. But what they say is exactly, and what they do is exactly what their parents and grandparents have been saying or doing. And what we need in India, therefore, is a new brand of leaders. In industry and business, it has happened. Right? Professional businesses have come up. They have become role models. In politics, it is yet to happen. Right? So that is a serious problem. And finally, I want to ask the question, and that is because Supriyo ended with that. These projects have been cleared in the last year, you said, right?
This is up to August of this year.
But this announcement was made about a year ago, right? The CCI?
The CCI.
Yeah, so about a year. What were they doing 9 years? Because I remember in 2008, I had compiled this list of projects that were, held up. And in 2004, I'm sure they were held up too. So, our government has to a bit more fleet-footed to be able to take on the opportunities that are presenting themselves in front of India. Thank you.